great-looking t-shirts, hoodies, and sweatshirts. The TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. You're listening to Scott Wheeler and Through the Looking Glass on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us on TNT Radio. Before I get started, let me remind you again, you can follow us on Twitter at Newscap Group, Twitter or X, whatever they're calling it these days, at Newscap Group. And you'll want to hear today's broadcast. It's going to be very interesting. First, let's address the news of this week with regards to our topic today and what President Biden said at the UN in a UN speech that was somewhat chilling in some sense, the way he addressed, surrendered the nation and adopted a mindset that is somewhat anti-American in my estimation. Saying that we're not alone. We can't deal with the problems alone. The U.S. has alone. We need all our partners in the world. What a lame excuse. We actually don't. We've led the world for nearly 100 years. It's about time we have a leader who acts like it. Anyway, we're not going to get into the political component of his speech. We are going to get into the scientific component of his speech. And here is a quote from what he said at the UN on Tuesday. Record-breaking heat waves in the United States and China, wildfires ravaging North America. I should say that this is a direct quote from the White House press report on what he said. So the grammatical errors and sentence fragments are not me misquoting him. It is me quoting what his press team has put out to journalists. So I'll start again. Quote, record-breaking heat waves in the United States and China, period. Wildfires ravaging North America and Southern Europe, a fifth year of drought in the Horn of Africa, tragic flooding in Libya that has killed thousands of people. Taken together, these snapshots tell an urgent story of what awaits us if we fail to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and begin to climate-proof our world. Climate-proof our world. It's a strange idea. From day one, my administration, the United States, has treated this crisis as the existential threat that it is, not only to us, but to all of humanity. Now, let me bring in a real scientist to do some analytical work on the existential crisis. Bruce Everett, PhD, is a specialist in global oil markets and international energy and environmental policy. He holds an AB from Princeton University, an MA, MALD, and PhD from the Fletcher School. After starting his career in the International Affairs Office of the U.S. Department of Energy and its predecessor agencies between 1974 and 1980, he worked as an executive for the ExxonMobil Corporation. His energy industry experience includes strategic planning, industry analysis, and forecasting. Dr. Everett, welcome to Through the Looking Glass. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate the chance to be on the program.
Is what the president has called the existential, is the climate really an existential threat at this point? Is this global warming, as they used to call it, a threat in your estimation?
The simple answer to that, Scott, is no. We've been talking about this for quite a long time. Several of my friends and colleagues at the CO2 Coalition, I think, who've been on your program, have done an excellent job explaining that carbon dioxide is, in fact, a benign molecule that has a lot of beneficial properties for the world. And that what people are doing is they are confusing weather and climate. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very, very small. And the number of factors that influence the weather is huge. Ocean currents, clouds, the solar radiation, all kinds of different things. And I think the scientific basis for this nonsensical argument has long been gone. And the only reason you keep hearing it is that there's an echo chamber in the media. Now, there are really two parts to this, Scott, I think that should be addressed. The scientific part, I think my colleagues at the CO2 Coalition have done a wonderful job of explaining that to your listeners. But there's also an economic part, which is what I've been working on lately. And the economic part is the argument that the world is in the process of transitioning away from fossil fuels and cutting back on carbon dioxide emissions. And you'll all be very happy when we do this because you'll have a cleaner and cheaper energy system and the world will just be a wonderful place. So I decided to ask the question, is that actually true? Now, if you'll permit me to be a little bit facetious for a minute, here's an analogy that I think is a good one. I'm a Boston Red Sox fan. And if a prominent sports writer called me up and said, hey, isn't it great that the Boston Red Sox are on their way to another World Series win? I could do one of two things. I could say, well, he's an expert, he must know. Or I could actually go and look at the numbers. And if I went and looked at the numbers, what I would discover is that the Red Sox are in last place in their division and have been mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. So that would tell me, be very careful when experts tell you things. So what I've done over the last year or so is I put together a paper that basically looks at these questions. And if you look at the numbers, what you'll discover is something very interesting. The wealthy countries, including the US, Canada, and Europe, have been making small cuts in carbon dioxide emissions at enormous cost, while the rest of the world continues to use all the fossil fuels they can get their hands on without any regard for the amount of carbon dioxide that they're emitting into the atmosphere. And as a result, fossil fuel use has actually been increasing and shows no signs of stopping. And carbon dioxide emissions are increasing and showing no signs of stopping. So the question is, regardless of what you think of climate science, do you want to support a policy in the United States in which we spend large amounts of your money making tiny cuts in carbon dioxide at great expense? And in my paper, I've looked at two different areas that I think are worth considering. The first is electric power. Now, we have been, for the last 50 years, trying to figure out how to get more wind and solar into the electric power grid. And we're now at a point where we're a little over 10% renewable energy after 50 years. Well, what's the problem here? Why is this taking so long? Well, there are really two answers to that. One is these technologies are extremely expensive. I'm amazed, for example, that we continue to teach our school children, hey, the sun is free, the wind is free, this is the way we should power our economy. And that may be true, but the machinery it takes to convert those sources of energy into electricity are extremely expensive.
We should point out that also it not only is the materials to create the windmills and the solar panels, et cetera, it also calls on using mining materials like lanthanides and rare earths, neodymium, iron, boron, things like this, that the same people essentially oppose the mining of these rare earth elements. And so aren't they at cross purpose at some point in your estimation?
Absolutely, Scott. Many of these critical materials we get from China. And people don't want to look at that. So what we're doing in some ways is we have spent the last 50 years trying to get energy independence, and we achieved that a few years ago. And we are now in the process of constraining the production of US fossil fuels, and in return, giving that power over to hostile countries who produce the components that we need for these renewable energy sources. That doesn't make any sense to me. But even setting that aside, the problems with wind and solar have to do with a fatal flaw that these technologies have. There are two kinds of electricity generation, called dispatchable and non-dispatchable. Now, unlike, say, for example, gasoline, which you can go down and buy at your local gas station whenever you need it. Electricity has to be generated moment to moment by the power company to meet the demand because there's no economically viable way of storing it. So we have lots of technologies, for example, coal and natural gas and nuclear, where the power plant can provide you with whatever electricity you want, moment to moment, to meet the demand. But wind and solar only provide electricity when nature decides to give it to you. And that may not be when it's demanded. So this causes all kinds of problems in the management of the grid. And basically what you have to have is wind power, and you have to have something to back it up for when the wind isn't blowing.
Isn't this what California saw after they began shutting down their nuclear power plants and began to convert to renewables? They saw a lot of difficulty, grayouts and grayouts as they called them at the time, but brownouts and warnings. I know from years past living in California, the warnings that you shouldn't run your air conditioner during peak times because there was an overload on the grid. And so, have you seen any evidence that the proponents of this renewable energy change have calculated how they plan on dealing with the shortfalls in that system?
The answer to that is no. I don't see any evidence whatsoever that anyone has a plan for dealing with this. Now, in our case, in the United States, if you have 10 or so percent, you can struggle through this. But let's take a look at our friends over in Germany. Now, Germany has more like 50% renewable energy in their grid. And people like Tom Friedman said, this is wonderful. This is the leading country in the world. But the Germans have discovered that there are times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and their grid becomes extremely unstable. And beyond that, German consumers pay between 2 and 3 times for electricity what Americans do. So, Scott, if you want to see where we're headed, just go look across the pond at Germany, and you'll see what's going on. Now, just this last week, the British Prime Minister Sunak basically said, we're postponing our drive towards zero carbon emissions because we just can't stand it.
Wow.
And you're starting to see people say, well, wait a minute now, this is a nice theory on paper, but people's lives are at stake here. Now, if what you want is to have a power system in the future that's very expensive and very unreliable and very unstable, then let's just keep going the way we're going and putting these renewables in there. One of the things I find really unfortunate is the United States has massive reserves of low-cost hydrocarbons. We have both coal and natural gas, hundreds of years worth of this stuff. And all we need in order to use it is the infrastructure to bring it from where it is to where it's needed.
Well,
and that would give a...
We've seen over the years, this went back to the 90s during the Clinton administration, where we saw the government lock up low sulfur coal deposits such as at the Cape Horowitz Plateau in Utah, lock them up, call them national treasures or whatever, and then prevent the use of that low sulfur coal, forcing us to import them, as you had previously pointed out, from places like China, or in this case, it was, I think, Indonesia is where we began getting our low sulfur coal at that point. Does it seem sort of deliberate at some point, in your estimation, that we're crippling our ability to provide energy for the country? And it's hard to imagine somebody isn't looking at the things that you're pointing out, for example, and saying this isn't going to work. It can't work. Who do you think these people are listening to that are telling them that it can?
Well,
Dr. Everett.
I'm reluctant, Scott, to question people's motives, but it seems to me that there are several forces at work here. One is you've got a lot of people making a lot of money off this. If you're in the wind turbine business, you can make a lot of money off this. If you're in the electric car business, you can make some money off this. There are also a bunch of people that are true believers in this, and these are the followers of Al Gore. But we also have in the United States, unfortunately, a number of people who believe that in central planning, that the government can do a better job of running the economy than the private market can. And they see this as a nice lever to increase the power of the central government, whether or not it really is a scientific certainty or not. It's a nice way to get more power into the hands of the central government. Now, my guess is, and it's my hope, and I guess I'm an optimist, as we go down this road, people are going to start to say, wait a minute, I'm spending all this money. My electric bills are going up. My natural gas bills are going up. My gasoline bills are going up. What am I getting for this? And you know what the answer is? Nothing. The United States currently accounts for about 14% of global CO2 emissions. So whatever you think about climate science, chipping away at a couple of percent of what the United States emits isn't going to make any difference to the amount of CO2 in the world. During the past 20 years, as I show in my paper, where we've cut back a little bit on CO2 emissions, primarily because we swapped out coal for natural gas, the Chinese have just been digging coal out like it's going out of style. And they've tripled their CO2 emissions in the last 20 plus years. And you'll notice that Ambassador Kerry went over there just a few weeks ago to try to convince the Chinese to, hey, help us with this climate problem. And they told him to pound sand.
They did send him packing for sure, and were in a very disrespectful way. But yes. It sounds like what you're saying is, and this is a familiar concept, and that is, as we reduce our CO2 emissions in order to accommodate our use of energy, other nations' CO2 emissions are going to increase accordingly. Sort of like when we shut down our only rare earth mine in Southern California in the interest of the environment, and then began importing all of our rare earths from China and other places. It didn't stop the mining; it just transferred it to somewhere else. Right. We're speaking with Dr. Bruce Everett. We're going to take a short time out, and when we come back, we'll talk about the electric vehicles and what can happen and what the potential problems are with that kind of transportation. We'll take a short time out. We'll be right back with more on TNT's Through the Looking Glass.
From national security to global corruption, you're with Scott Wheeler and Through the Looking Glass on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler, broadcasting live from Washington, D.C., and we are speaking with a preeminent expert in the field of the economics of the electric renewable energy transfer from fossil fuels into renewable energies. It's Bruce Everett, PhD. And we were in the break, they played the Marano Minute, Mark Marano talking about the United Nations and their declaration of cutting CO2 emissions around the world and reducing us to primitive lifestyles. Is that and I should point out, Marcus Morano has been my longtime colleague for decades, and we discussed these issues many times over the years. And is Dr. Everett, in your estimation, is Mr. Morano correct in his assessment of the UN's view of climate policy and how we must reduce emissions and basically eliminate our current standard of living?
Yeah, Mark is right. And I think the message that people ought to get from this, Scott, is that the climate agenda that's being pushed on the American public basically suggests that we just continue to reduce our standard of living. Now, we're never going to get anywhere close to zero carbon dioxide emissions. And the reason for that is that I think there will come a point, and I hope it comes soon, when the American people will say enough. I'm paying a lot of money. I'm not getting anything for it, and I want it to stop. But beyond that, as we were saying in the earlier part of the show, most of the other countries in the world are paying no attention to this whatsoever. They understand that energy is critical to their economic growth. They're trying to get poor people into the middle class, and they know that they need a vibrant energy sector in order to do that, and that comes from fossil fuels. So they're not paying any attention to this. Now, we keep lecturing them on the need for carbon dioxide reductions. So what happens is, I find this very odd. Every year, the United Nations has what they call a conference of parties that is supposed to be the implementation mechanism for the climate change agenda. And these are meetings of tens of thousands of people. The one last year was in Egypt. I believe the one later this year, is in the United Arab Emirates. But in these meetings, the poor countries come and make carbon dioxide emissions reduction promises that they're never going to keep in return for large flows of money from the West that we're never going to give them. And then they all go home and congratulate themselves on doing a wonderful job on this. This is absolutely la la land. Now, if we talk about the United States here, what we have to be careful of is, let's not get ourselves into this fairy tale, because it affects people's lives. Now, we were touching on a moment ago on electric vehicles. Mobility is critical to us, not just in practical terms, but it's part of who we are. It's part of being a free people. And electric vehicles have two fundamental problems with them. One is they're just flat out too expensive. And the second thing is that their performance is poor because they need huge batteries that have limited range under the best of circumstances. Now, what we've been doing for the last several years is trying to push these onto the public with a series of subsidies and other things like that. But you have to bear in mind, and again, I want to get back to this point, just look at the numbers. There are roughly 250 million light-duty vehicles in the United States, cars, pickup trucks, vans, SUVs. And the government has been able to push a few million electric cars into the marketplace. And most of those, surveys show, are owned by upper-middle-class California males. And these are people who have money. They think that electric cars are cool. They like to drive them around. It's fine. But the size of that demographic is very limited. The average American wants a car that works well for him and that is affordable. That's what he wants. And people are going to find out fairly quickly, I think, that the ability of the government to force us to buy electric cars is very limited. Because what's going to happen is, we've had a number of states, and my own state government here in Massachusetts is talking about this too. They'll ban electric car sales after some year, 2035, whatever it might be. And when that happens, the car companies have to sell electric vehicles at a low enough price to get you to buy them. And the cost of gasoline vehicles will go up to cover the difference. And as the cost of owning and operating a car goes up and up and up, again, I think people are going to start to say, wait a minute, what am I getting for this? I used to enjoy buying a new car every few years, and now I can't do that. Now I have to buy a very expensive, smaller car with lower performance. And why am I doing that? Why am I being forced to put solar cells on my roof? Why am I being told that I can't put a natural gas stove in my house? Why are all these things happening? And the answer is that these things are not wanted by the public. There's no demand for them. They're too expensive. And the government can only manage to jam a small amount of this into the marketplace with subsidies and mandates. But again, perhaps being too optimistic, it's time for the American people to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to live my life.
There is a group of people you referenced earlier that actually are the true believers. It's not the political class elites that are running around peddling these things that are the true believers. They are the phony believers. You can tell by the fact they build their houses on the shores of the oceans they claim are going to rise soon. But there are a bedrock of hardcore believers. We've interviewed some on this broadcast in the past. One particular, Max Wilbert, he's out in Nevada fighting the Thacker Pass mine, lithium mine operation, trying to get it shut down. A true believer in all sense of the words, a very nice young man, but he believes that the only way that we can survive, the world can survive, is by reducing population and for everyone to live sort of like he does. When I said he's a true believer, he actually lives that kind of environmental lifestyle of probably something not much more sophisticated than a yurt with very little modern conveniences. How many of those do you think there really are out there? How many of the true believers that are willing to sacrifice their lifestyle in order to, what they say, save the planet?
My guess, Scott, is that's a very small group of people. There's another group of people, and I know many of them myself, who basically say, I don't want to give up my lifestyle, but I'll put a solar panel on my roof. I'll drive a Tesla. And that'll be my signal that I'm a virtuous person and that I'm trying to save the planet. And what they don't do is to, as I said earlier, to look at the numbers. They don't see what impact that actually has on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, my response to that is, if you want to buy an electric car and put solar panels on your roof, and that's important to you, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But first of all, don't make me do it. And secondly, don't make me pay for yours. Now, that sounds to me like a perfectly reasonable position on my part. But if your goal is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emissions in the world, you better get on a plane and go to Beijing and New Delhi, not Washington, because that's where the carbon dioxide is coming from.
We're speaking with Dr. Bruce Everett. He's an expert on the economics of the transition to a green economy, and we are. A lot of this, how do I say this without being overtly political? Although I think I've already crossed that line a few times. but nuclear energy could provide the electricity we needed. We could shut down probably most of the coal plants and go to nuclear energy. But the very same people who say coal is dangerous refuse to acknowledge nuclear energy, and therefore we have no hope of doing that. It seems like there's something else in the mix here. What do you say, Dr. Everett?
Well, nuclear energy is a very interesting subject, because if you were starting with a clean piece of paper, you said, how do I design a modern electricity grid for a large continental country? Nuclear energy would be at the core of that. It's relatively inexpensive. It's very clean. It's extremely efficient, performs very well. Now, the problem is, over the last 50 years or so, it's gotten a terrible reputation from the public, I think unjustly. But one of the problems we've had is whenever people try to build nuclear power plants, the local opposition delays it and delays it and delays it, which drives the cost up and makes it infeasible. And in fact, we have a number of nuclear power plants in the country. We have one in Massachusetts called Pilgrim in Plymouth County. There's another one called Indian Point in New York that are perfectly usable nuclear power plants. And there's a drive to shut them down. So this is a political problem. I would hope that this would be another area where the public could come to better understand the benefits of nuclear energy. And you're quite right. That could be the core for the future. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be a while before we can make that turn. In the meantime, we have natural gas. And you can build a very clean, very efficient natural gas combined cycle power plant. All you need is the infrastructure to bring the natural gas to where it's needed.
That would be like a turbine running from natural gas and a turbine that generates the electricity.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Combined cycle is a great technology because there are two ways of making electricity. A simple cycle turbine is basically a jet engine. Okay. You put natural gas in, it turns the turbine and makes electricity. But out the end of that comes hot exhaust. So in combined cycle, you take that hot exhaust and you boil steam and you run another turbine. That way you can get, instead of 40%, you can get 60% efficiency, and it's very clean. And, an 800 megawatt or 200 megawatt natural gas power plant would take up about a city block.
And so, and then you recycle the vapor and use the heat from the turbine to basically run a steam.
That's exactly right. And what comes out of that? What comes out of that primarily is heat and water. That's the byproduct of that. Natural gas is cleaned at the production site, so there's very little contaminant in it. It's this is great stuff. And what drives me really crazy, Scott, is living on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. We are at the far end of the logistical system, and I have so many of my friends and neighbors here that are adamantly opposed to the use of natural gas. When what they're going to do is shoot themselves in the foot.
Why? What is the general complaint by the environmentalists of the use of natural gas? Is it the mining of it, or is it fracking?
It's a fossil fuel, and it emits carbon dioxide.
I see.
Now, if you are a person who thinks that carbon dioxide is at the source of all our problems, you will always get the wrong answer. And you will give up some very important opportunities that you have. So, for example, heating your house with natural gas, cooking your food with natural gas, heating your water with natural gas. These are the best, cleanest, safest, most reliable ways of doing it. And it would be a shame if we gave these up in return for putting stress on an electricity grid that's becoming increasingly expensive and unreliable.
So what is the point, because of your economics background, what is the point at which you'll have a backlash that the political class will not be able to sustain its transition? What's the point at which people will say no more, or enough people will say no more, and it began a massive electoral pushback against this?
Again, Scott, I wish I knew the answer to that. I hope that's soon. And when I talk to people about this problem here locally, rather than talk about the science of global warming, what I tell them is, look at your utility bills. Now, in the last couple of years, the average American family has paid between $1,000 and $2,000 more for gasoline than they did before the Biden administration came into power. Now, that's a big bite for most people. Now, if you're John Kerry or Al Gore, maybe you don't care about that. But most of us do. Now, if people look at their electricity bill and their natural gas bill, they're going up. And as more constraints are put on that, and as the infrastructure to bring the cheap natural gas to where it's needed is impeded consistently, those bills are going to continue to go up. So I'm hoping that as people start looking at their economic situation, they're going to say, what am I getting for this? And the answer, of course, is you're getting nothing for it.
We are coming up on a break. I was going to ask if you could stay on till the top of the hour, Dr. Everett,
Sure.
if you have time. Oh, great.
Happy to do so.
Appreciate that very much. We'll take another short time out. I want to ask when we come back, there's a lot of information in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal regarding a more production and efficient production of oil right now, and yet the price of gas is going up. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll ask Dr. Everett for his opinion on why that is and how it's affecting the price of gas. You're listening to TNT Radio's Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler.
Give me a minute with TNT Radio's Steve Malsberg.
Does anyone know the name Rafał Ziemkiewicz? He's a columnist and a TV host, and he received an award last week from Poland's Minister of Culture, a special award named for a Polish historian. Seems like a non-story, but according to the Allgemeiner, over the last decade, Ziemkiewicz has established himself as one of the most vocal anti-Semites in Poland. In a video posted to his YouTube channel in 2021, he claimed that the Jewish victims of a pogrom in July of 1941 in Poland had essentially deserved their fate. He said These Jews have historically been the exploiters, the leeches. There have been no bigger enemy of the Polish peasant than the Jewish middlemen who screwed him for cash in every possible way. And in his most recent book, he claims that Zionism under the influence of the Holocaust, or rather the myth of the Holocaust that they created, acquired a peculiar cruelty. Get the idea? So how the heck does this creep get an award from the Polish government? Maybe Joe Scarborough should ask his brother-in-law, the U.S. ambassador to Poland. I don't know. Thanks for giving me a minute. I'm Steve Malzberg for TNT Radio.
My therapist had told me that I needed to go to AA meetings, but I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go because I didn't want to be an alcoholic. That was not what I wanted to grow up and be. I didn't want to go to AA, but I did, and it wasn't what I expected by any means. It was friendly. I could feel it. I could feel the happiness. It's really great.
Visit AA.org for more information and download the Meeting Guide app to find a meeting near you.
Tracking global corruption and threats that undermine our security. Through the Looking Glass. This is Through the Looking Glass with Scott Wheeler on TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler, and we have with us Dr. Bruce Everett. He is an expert in the field of economics and energy, and he is a board member at the CO2 Coalition, which does a lot of excellent work. It's mostly scientists producing reporting and analytics that seem to be contrary to most of what passes for science from the government sponsored scientists who claim that we are in a hysterical warming period, and if we don't cut CO2 emissions, then the planet's going to burn up. We've talked quite a bit about that over the past year on this broadcast, and one of the things that we find interesting, we were talking about in the last segment about what the point at which the American people will rebel. At some point, they'll reach a tipping point where Americans will take electoral, will make the politicians imposing high gas prices and high fuel prices and the cost to heat a home, etc. And they will have an electoral response to that and vote out those who are promoting this idea. But at the same time, the U.S. Energy Information Administration expects U.S. crude oil production to surpass 12.9 million barrels per day for the first time in late 2023 and to exceed 13 million barrels per day in early 2024. Dr. Everett, why are we seeing such tremendous oil production and at the same time gas prices spiking as they have in the past couple of years?
Well, Scott, let's take a look at the history here. I've been working on this problem for the last 50 years or so. And starting with the Nixon administration, we started to worry about how to make the United States oil independent, if not energy independent. And we believed for many, many years that the U.S. resource base for oil was simply too small to support the demand that we needed. And we just struggled through this as best we can. And about 10 years ago, the technology of hydraulic fracturing or fracking came along and unlocked all kinds of additional oil and gas that we never thought that we could get at. And U.S. production really started to take off. And we reached the point around 2018, 2019, at which we were, in fact, producing more oil than we were consuming. And this gave the United States a lot of control over the world oil market. Now, I'm not talking about control in the sense that there's somebody in Washington that's pulling the levers. What I am saying is that when demand grew in the world, the United States would start producing a little bit more. And when demand leveled off, the price would drop and Americans would produce a little bit less. But the control of the oil market globally was taken away from OPEC. Now, unfortunately, and forgive me for getting a little bit political here, but when President Biden took office, he tried to do two contradictory things. He wanted to tell the climate activists that he was going to impede and constrain U.S. oil production because they don't like fossil fuel production. And he did that. And he did it in two ways. One is he stopped certain infrastructure projects. But the other thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is he told the oil industry, I'm going to try to put you out of business. Now, whether he can or can't, that's not going to be something that encourages people to invest in new wells and new production. Now, at the same time, he went overseas to Saudi Arabia and even Venezuela and tried to get them to increase their production. So in effect, this goal that we've had for the last 50 years of being energy independent was finally realized, and then it was thrown away. Now, what you say is correct. The prediction is that we will be producing record amounts of oil next year and probably the year after. That doesn't mean that's the most we could have produced. Perhaps we could have produced even more than that. But the point is, we've basically put a brake on investment in the oil industry, and that includes production, it includes pipelines, it includes refineries, it includes distribution. Now, the oil market in the United States and globally is very competitive. There are a lot of companies competing for this market. And if the government would just leave it alone, it would grow to the point where these competitive forces would suppress the price of gasoline for the average consumer. That's my view. We would build more refining capacity, we would build more distribution capacity, and we would drill more wells. Now, instead, what we've done is we've handed the control of this back to what's called OPEC Plus, which is our friends in Saudi Arabia and Russia, and they are manipulating it for their own purposes. This is really a shame, and this is something I really wish had not happened. But the thing we need to do more than anything else here, Scott, is to make sure that we tell the oil industry, go out there and produce oil, move it, refine it, distribute it, get it to the consumer at the lowest price you can. And that's something that we are not doing at the present time. And you're seeing the result of that. You're seeing high gasoline prices, as well as high prices of other kinds of energy. And this is a shame in a country which has only recently discovered that it has far bigger resources of hydrocarbons than we ever thought possible. And anybody in his right mind would want to put those resources to work as quickly and as efficiently as we can, and not play this game of trying to suppress what we do in the United States and encourage people overseas who may not have our interests at heart to compensate for it.
So when Biden first took office, he canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Is that the kind of thing that would have had an effect on the price of oil, even though it's
yes, to me, but that's a second order effect. The primary effect is when he said there's no place for fossil fuels in a Biden administration. And if you recall, in his last State of the Union speech, he said, I'm telling the oil industry not to worry because they can still produce for another 10 years. Well, I've worked in the oil industry. You don't make investments for 10 years. You make investments for 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years. Anybody today that's making an investment in oil production is taking a big risk because you're doing it in the face of an overtly hostile government. Not a good thing.
So similar to what happened in Hawaii with the fire, you had the electric company, instead of investing in upgrading its equipment, it instead was investing in transitional energy or green energy projects and neglected its electrical grid, which ultimately led to, when the high winds came, led to the initiation of the fire there that claimed so many lives and did so much damage.
We had the same problem in Southern California, where basically the government in Sacramento tells the utilities, spend your money on renewable energy, don't bury your power lines, don't upgrade the equipment. And when a power line goes down during a heavy wind and ignites a wildfire, sue the utility.
Sue the utility.
Yeah, sue the utility. So what we need to do is, I think as a people and as a government, we need to say we need the most modern, efficient, extensive energy structure we can. Electricity, oil, gas, coal, nuclear where we can. And let's get to work making sure that we continue to have that for the benefit of the American people. That's what's going to support continued economic growth and continued increases in living standards.
The president, Biden, that is, seems to be pandering to the global warming, and going back to before the election, the environmental extremists, they seem to think they would have control in a Biden administration. They would have a lot of influences. A lot of people didn't believe that was going to be the case, but turned out they did. But he goes to the UN and says that we have this, we're all in this together, and that blames the tragic flooding in Libya and all these things that happen anyway, and tries to, and basically furthers this idea, this notion that whatever bad happens in weather is the fault of CO2. How does as a thinker on this, an intellectual, how do you see changing the belief among the American people who are basically hearing this and don't know any better? How do you change people's minds and help them to see that this is not really what it's being framed as?
Well, there are a couple of things. At the CO2 Coalition, Scott, what we're trying to do is to get out into the public as much credible, sound information as we possibly can. We're not doing propaganda. We're not proselytizing people. We're not saying, here's what's true, believe us. We're just saying, here's the information, here's the evidence as we can see it, make up your own mind. And that has some impact. We've also got an educational effort underway to try to get a better understanding of science in the schools. But I want to get back to my earlier point. I think personally that the most important driver of this is going to be the economic pressure that's put on the average American consumer by these government policies. And I'm hoping we'll get to the time fairly soon where people start to question why they're basically giving up all this money and losing some of their living standard, and what are they actually getting for it? And I think if they start to question that, they're going to very quickly conclude that they're really not getting anything for it. And I want to get back to one of the reasons I wrote this particular paper I just published, and that is that regardless of what you think about climate science, the United States is not the place where CO2 is coming from. It's coming from China and India and the rest of the developing world, and they have no intention of stopping. Now, I generally try to be analytical and not get too much into morality on this, but to me, it's immoral for the rich countries to tell the poor countries they can't grow.
And they can't have, and they can't have electricity, and they can't have air conditioning. It reminds me of it was the Brazil, I think 1992 was the year there was a UN climate summit in
Rio.
In Rio, the Rio de Janeiro climate summit. And because there is in the north of Brazil and along the Rio Negro and the Amazon River, there are enormous tribes of Caboclo. They call them Caboclo and other natural indigenous tribes there. And so they built these teepees, basically, or tents for them around where the summit was going to be. They wanted them to participate. And they brought them down from the jungles to, or the rainforests, as they call them, to participate in the climate summit. And when they got there, they demanded air-conditioned hotel rooms like the other UN personnel were staying in. Does it not that illustrate precisely what you were just pointing to, that it's not right for the developed world to tell the third world that they cannot have access to electricity and improve their lives?
Absolutely true. And another point to make on this, Scott, that I think is important is when when we talk about transportation, we tend to be overly focused on the United States. Now, we're a pretty mature transportation system. We have more cars in the United States than we have licensed drivers. But in the rest of the world, there are several billion people who would love to have that mobility. I think as people start to come out of poverty, they want better food, better security, better housing, but they also want mobility. And they're not going to drive Teslas. They're going to look for the cheapest, most efficient way of getting around in an automobile. And if you look at the cars,
yeah, most places, if they bought a Tesla, they'd have to live in it.
That's true. It's
and eat it.
You hear many people say that, gee, China is way ahead of us on the production of electric cars. Well, the reason for that is that China has no oil. So the oil they have to import, and it's very expensive. They have a lot of coal. So what they want to do is use the coal to make electricity and stick it in the car. So when you talk about a Chinese electric car, you're really talking about a coal-powered automobile.
A coal power. Yeah, it's true. I as an admission, I had a Tesla for about a year. The problem of charge, it did perform well. It was I didn't buy it for environmental reasons. I bought it because I test drove one and I thought it was spectacular. It was very quiet, had great pickup, but recharging it is very difficult because I live in a high-rise apartment. It's not like I can pull into the garage and charge it. So I sold it after about a year, but the inconvenience of running it was amazing. When you have to go, I would have to drive 20 minutes to get to a fast charging station. And I live in the city, and it would take 15-20 minutes to get to a fast charging station. Otherwise, you have to park it for 8-10 hours and slow charge it, and you also pay for that. And so it just doesn't seem practical in general. For some people, it might be if you own a home and you have a garage and you have the charging station in there and you don't do a lot of driving, it would work. But for most people, it's not practical at all. It's going to be a niche market for some time to come. But my point was of telling that meandering story was that I wanted to get a license plate to differentiate me from other people that said powered by coal, because it is. I didn't want anyone to confuse me with having some kind of environmental virtue. That is the essence of this. It is coal powered, and China has huge coal reserves, and so electric vehicles make a lot of sense for it, since, as you point out, they don't have a lot of oil.
That's right. And even if you look at places like Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia, they are using fossil fuels to the extent that they can get their hands on them. And there's an awful lot of gas in the world, and people are using it, developing it, making electricity out of it. And God bless them.
Let me, as we wind down to the top of the hour, let me say the name of this paper is A Primer on Climate Policy Math. You can find it at the CO2 Coalition. It is authored by Dr. Everett. You can find it at the CO2 Coalition website, co2coalition.com. .org, my apologies, CO2coalition.org. You can find it there, and it's, again, called A Primer on Climate Policy Math. And Dr. Everett, thank you so much for spending the time with us. This has been a great, enlightening hour.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate the chance to be on the program.
And for those of you listening, follow us at Newscap Group, on Twitter. And we will be back next week with another edition of Through the Looking Glass on TNT Radio. For Through the Looking Glass from Washington, D.C., I'm Scott Wheeler, signing off.